Hey, that's a key point, so let's hammer that home. So over the weekend, Savannah Guthrie and her family said, we will pay. That was on Saturday. So that if they then paid on Saturday, that would start the clock. We're now past 12-hour mark, and you say that Bitcoin account, there is no money inserted. For a lot of people that don't really understand Bitcoin or how that works, can you give a little context into that?
Maybe a little. You know, I'm not an expert in this, but you can see, it's visible what people deposit if you have the link, which we do. What is not visible is who gets the money.
To understand why two retired FBI profilers looked at this case and immediately saw something everyone else had missed, you first have to understand who these men are. Not just their titles, not just their resumes. You have to understand what they built, what they studied, and why their assessment of this case carries a different kind of weight than anything that has come out of the public conversation so far. James Fitzgerald spent years inside the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. He is not just a profiler. He is a forensic linguist, a man trained to read the hidden architecture of human communication, the words people choose, the patterns they repeat, the things they reveal without ever intending to. He developed the SESTA database at Quantico, a system built to catalog and compare written communications from offenders across the country. When a demand note surfaces in a case anywhere in the United States, that note gets run through a system that Fitzgerald helped create. That is the level of contribution this man made to the science of criminal investigation. Raymond Carr came from the same world. The Behavioral Science Unit, which later evolved into the Behavioral Analysis Unit, was not built on guesswork. It was built on direct, documented, systematic study of the most dangerous offenders in American history. Here is how that study actually worked. After conviction, after sentencing, after the courtroom had delivered its verdict and these offenders understood they were going to spend the rest of their lives inside a cell, investigators approached them. They waited for the moment when control had been stripped away entirely, when the only thing left was obscurity. And then they used that against them. They built up the offender's ego. They told them they wanted to learn from them.
I'd help solve more than a few cases looking at someone's language. This case is just so unusual and so different than other cases we've seen, especially because almost 3 months later, it remains unsolved. I can't help but think that the only thing that I keep coming back to is somehow this involves Savannah Guthrie, the TV personality, but something to do with her profession, something to do with someone who she's been in touch with over the years.
That they wanted to study them. And one by one, these offenders agreed to talk. Not out of remorse. Out of vanity. And that was exactly the point. What followed was not a casual conversation. It was a documented protocol of approximately 840 questions, applied to every single offender who agreed to participate, covering every crime they had ever committed. The answers built a database of human behavior that no classroom, no textbook, and no theory could have produced on its own. It was empirical. It was methodical. And it became the foundation of how the FBI understands the psychology of violent offenders to this day. These are the two men Brian Entin sat down with on April 30th. And when they looked at this case, they did not see what the public had been told to see for 3 months.
In the early days of the Behavioral Science Unit, which then evolved into the Behavioral Analysis Unit, the original profilers interviewed 38 serial offenders after conviction. And the way they did that is they typically waited a certain period of time and then approached them after they felt that the offender had realized they were going to spend the rest of their lives in prison and they've lost all control over what happens to them. And they basically would, at that point, feel like they are going to eventually just die in obscurity. We used that to our advantage by basically building up their egos, telling them we wanted to study them, we wanted to learn from them. And then these offenders started to agree to be interviewed by the people in the behavioral science unit.
James Fitzgerald said something in that interview that stopped the conversation cold. He said that as a forensic linguist, language tells you more about a case than most people realize. And then he said that the one thing he keeps coming back to, the thread he cannot stop pulling, is Savannah Guthrie. Not because she did anything wrong, not because she is implicated in any way, but because something about this case connects to her world, her profession, the people who have moved through her orbit over the years. Raymond Carr agreed. And he went further. He described a pattern, a progression, the kind that does not announce itself as dangerous at the start, because at the start, it never is. It begins with observation, distance, watching from a place where the subject cannot see you watching. Then it moves. Contact attempts, small ones, easily dismissed. A message that gets flagged and filed away. An email that reads as excessive but not threatening. A social media interaction that crosses a line but not far enough to trigger alarm. And then it moves again. This is the escalation curve. And according to Carr, this is the framework that explains everything about how January 31st happened. Not as a sudden decision, not as an impulsive act, but as the final point on a line that had been extending for years. That is not a theory constructed from nothing. That is a pattern documented across hundreds of cases involving fixated individuals who could not access their primary subject and eventually redirected toward someone in that subject's orbit. The behavior is known. The psychology is mapped. And when Fitzgerald and Carr looked at the evidence in this case, that is the pattern they recognized. Think about what that means for the timeline. This case does not begin on January 31st. It does not begin in the weeks before. It begins years earlier, in behavior that looked unremarkable at the time. An email, a comment, a message that Savannah's team probably noted and moved past because nothing had happened yet. Because the line between concerning and dangerous had not yet been crossed in any visible way. But the line was moving. Fitzgerald was direct about one specific thing. In his years working in New York, he maintained a close working relationship with a retired NYPD lieutenant who served as head of security at NBC at 30 Rock. He was there once a month, working cases involving members of their on-air staff. Mostly women. Mostly receiving letters, unusual phone calls, communications that existed in that uncomfortable space between obsession and threat. He said he cannot believe that over the years, Savannah Guthrie has not been receiving the same. Emails, social media messages, fan correspondence that crosses lines in ways that are documented somewhere, filed somewhere, and have not yet been connected to the right question. That somewhere is where Fitzgerald believes the answer to this case is waiting. And now the single most important sentence either profiler said in that entire interview. Investigators need to go back through a minimum of 5 years of correspondence directed at Savannah Guthrie. Every unusual message.
And so
I'm hoping they're still involved right now, and there are leads being run by them to help, assess and offer, behavioral aspects to, the gumshoe work of this person and driving by that week and that night, and any DNA connection, whatever. So I hope that's happening, but I hope they're also, and I'm also a forensic linguist, so language is very important to me, and I've helped solve more than a few cases looking at someone's language. This case is just so unusual and so different than other cases we've seen, especially because almost 3 months later, it remains unsolved.
Every escalating pattern of contact. Every name that appears more than once in a way that registered as off, even slightly. Because inside that record, there is almost certainly a name that connects to a location, and a location that connects to Tucson, and Tucson that connects to a quiet street and a front door that should never have been opened that night. That is not speculation. That is a documented investigative direction delivered on the record by 2 of the most experienced behavioral analysts the FBI has ever produced. And it changes everything about where this investigation needs to look next. Now comes the part of this case that has consumed the most public attention. And according to the profilers, it is also the part that has done the most damage to the investigation by pulling focus in entirely the wrong direction. The Bitcoin. In the days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, ransom demands surfaced. The currency specified was Bitcoin. The communications came through anonymized channels. Deadlines were issued. And the family of one of the most recognizable names in American television found themselves staring at a transaction they desperately wanted to believe was real, because if it was real, it meant Nancy was alive and there was still a path to bringing her home. Savannah Guthrie said publicly that the family would pay. The clock started. The world watched the Bitcoin wallet address that had been made visible. And then the deadline passed. And nothing happened. No contact. No confirmation. No exchange. The wallet received nothing. Harvey Levin reported on this directly. The trail was followed. The FBI invested significant resources attempting to trace the email account attached to those ransom communications. And the trail went cold. Completely. The account was anonymized in a way that made it, in practical terms, untraceable. Which is exactly why someone chose it. Here is what that detail reveals, and why it matters more than it first appears. Whoever sent those ransom notes understood how to move invisibly in a digital environment. That is not accidental knowledge. That is not something a person learns in the moment. Setting up an anonymous email, attaching it to a Bitcoin wallet, structuring a demand in a way that creates urgency without creating a traceable footprint, that is preparation. That is someone who thought about the aftermath before the event even occurred. But here is the contradiction that Fitzgerald identified immediately. If the ransom was real, where was the note at the scene? If the goal was financial, why was no communication left at Nancy's home that night establishing the terms? Every documented financially motivated abduction in the investigative record begins with contact at the point of the crime. That is how the transaction is initiated. That is how the clock starts. But there was nothing left behind. No note. No instructions. No terms. The notes came later. Through media. Through outside channels. Not from the scene. Fitzgerald's assessment is unambiguous. Those communications did not come from the person who entered Nancy Guthrie's home. They came from opportunists. People who saw a high-profile disappearance attached to a famous name and recognized an opening. A Bitcoin account already set up. Anonymous channels already in place. A grieving family desperate enough to pay. They inserted themselves into the chaos. And in doing so, they sent the investigation chasing a financial trail that had nothing to do with the actual perpetrator. Think about what that means for the last 3 months. Law enforcement resources. Media attention, public focus, all of it pointed toward a motive that the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance never had. While the real threat, the behavioral one, the correspondence trail, the escalation pattern, the 5 years of documented contact with Savannah's public life, sat in the background, quieter and less visible and far more important. 30,000 tips came in. A source close to the investigation confirmed to News Nation that the case has stalled, with most of those leads producing nothing actionable. And when you understand what the profilers said about motive, the reason becomes clear. The answer to this case was never going to emerge from a broad public tip pool. It was never going to come from someone across the country who thought they recognized the man on the security camera footage. The answer exists in a much smaller circle. A specific file. A specific name. A specific moment where a line was crossed in a piece of correspondence and someone noted it, documented it, and moved on because nothing dangerous had happened yet. That moment is out there. And according to James Fitzgerald and Raymond Carr, it has been out there the entire time. The investigation just has not been looking in the right place.
Is the
Until
factor
now.
behind why the mother was taken.
Ray, is it, for the behaviorists, is it at the FBI? I mean, because this is, as Jim said, this is such an unusual case. There really haven't been any cases or many cases like it with an elderly person abducted this way. Does it make it more difficult? Because I always thought like the BAU goes back and looks at other cases and other people that they've interviewed and goes into a database and sort of compares past cases to this to try to figure out what happened. But if there hasn't really been a past case like this, how much more difficult is it?
It's not that it's more difficult. It's just that you're basing it on the experience that you have. And there are databases that the Bureau has, I know, in language, in demand notes and things of that nature. Jim actually developed that down in Quantico, the CSTAT database, which was all communications in there. However,
3 months ago, a private woman left a family dinner and went home. She did not make it to church the next morning. Her phone was still inside the house. Her belongings were untouched. And the world has spent 90 days trying to understand why. The financial theory failed. The Bitcoin trail went cold. 30,000 tips produced nothing that broke the case open. And the man captured on security camera, calm and deliberate and moving like someone following a script written long before that night, has not been publicly identified, and investigators have not announced a single arrest. But on April 30th, the shape of this investigation changed. Not because a new piece of physical evidence surfaced. Not because a witness came forward with something they had been holding back. But because two men who spent their careers mapping the psychology of dangerous individuals looked at everything this case had produced and said, with clarity and without hesitation, that the target was never Nancy. It was always Savannah. Now build the full picture from what the profilers described. This is not a career criminal moving through a pattern of opportunistic offenses. The behavior does not fit that model. There are no hallmarks of someone who operates across multiple targets for financial gain. What the behavioral profile shows instead is a fixation. A specific, sustained, deepening focus on one individual. An individual who is public enough to study, but protected enough to be unreachable. Savannah Guthrie has one of the most visible profiles in American media. Every morning, millions of people watch her on the Today Show. Her voice, her mannerisms, her public appearances, her family, all of it accessible in ways that most people's lives never are. For someone developing a fixation, that visibility is not just an attraction. It is a map. A map that, studied long enough and carefully enough, eventually leads past the public surface into the private world underneath. And in that private world, there is a mother. Quiet. Not famous. Living the kind of life that does not attract attention, in a city that does not carry the same security infrastructure that surrounds a national television personality in New York. Nancy Guthrie was reachable in a way that Savannah was not. Former FBI Assistant Director John Miller stated that the person responsible is most likely local. Someone with specific knowledge of the Tucson area and of Nancy's living conditions. And that detail connects directly to what the escalation curve produces at its endpoint. By the time this person moved from observation to action, they knew enough. About the neighborhood. About the routines. About when Nancy would be home, and what the house looked like from the outside, and how to approach it without drawing attention. That knowledge does not come from one search. It comes from sustained, deliberate attention applied over time. Raymond Carr described the man on the security camera in terms that reframe the entire visual evidence of this case. The calm is real. The controlled movement is real. But the precision has edges. Small inconsistencies. Details that suggest this individual was not the architect. He was the executor. Someone handed a plan and trusted to carry it out. Which means somewhere behind what appears on that footage, there is a second layer. Someone who never stood in front of a camera. Someone who designed the approach, identified the target, studied the environment, and set the night of January 31st into motion from a position that left no visible trace. That person is the answer to this case. And the profilers believe the evidence that leads to that person is documented. It is sitting in a record somewhere. An email flagged by a network security team. A social media message that crossed enough of a line to get logged, but not enough to trigger intervention. A pattern of contact spread across months or years that in isolation looked like excessive fandom and in context looks like something else entirely. Fitzgerald said it plainly. Show him a pattern of escalating correspondence from the same individual, even across a span of years, and that becomes the investigative thread worth pulling. Because that thread leads to a name. And that name leads to a location. And that location, if the profilers are right, leads somewhere very close to Tucson. The reward is $1.2 million. It has been sitting unclaimed for 3 months. In most cases involving more than one person, in situations where a connected network of individuals holds information, money eventually breaks the silence. Someone talks. Someone decides the risk of staying quiet is no longer worth it. But here the silence holds. And that tells its own story. Either the people who know something are more afraid of the person responsible than they are motivated by the reward, or they do not yet understand that what they know matters. Both of those possibilities point in the same direction. The answer is close. It is contained. And someone in proximity to it is carrying it right now without fully realizing the weight of what they hold. On May 6th, the CW network is airing a national special on this case. That broadcast will bring a second wave of public attention to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Second waves do something specific in stalled investigations. They create pressure in places where pressure had started to ease. They reach people who had not been paying attention before. They surface details in the minds of individuals who heard something, saw something, noticed something, and then allowed the ordinary forward motion of life to push it to the back. Pressure has a way of producing the one mistake that changes everything. One conversation overheard by the wrong person. One behavior that finally registers as significant to someone who had been explaining it away. One detail that connects to another detail in a way that suddenly makes an entire picture visible. The investigative window on this case is not closed. Before any profiler made their assessment public, before any behavioral analysis was delivered on the record to Brian Entin, Savannah Guthrie said the thing no one else had yet said out loud. In her first interview after her mother's disappearance, speaking to her colleague Hoda Kotb, she asked the question that had been sitting beneath everything from the very beginning. She asked whether it happened because of her. She said it was too much to bear. To think that she had brought this to her mother's doorstep. That Nancy, private and quiet and entirely removed from the public world her daughter inhabits, had been pulled into something because of who her daughter was. That was not just a grieving daughter speaking. According to 2 former FBI profilers with decades of documented experience, it was the most accurate public statement made about this case. Savannah understood the shape of what had happened before the science confirmed it. Because she understood something no outside observer could fully see. That visibility carries a cost. That being watched by millions of people every morning means being watched by all of them, including the ones who watch differently. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 3 months. The case is active. The reward is unclaimed. And the behavioral trail that Fitzgerald and Carr described, 5 years of correspondence, escalating contact patterns, a fixation that built slowly and then crossed a line, that trail exists somewhere right now waiting to be examined with the right question in mind. If anything covered in this video connects to something that has stayed with you since January 31st, a person whose behavior shifted around that time, someone who expressed an unusual focus on Savannah Guthrie, anyone whose words or movements have not sat right in the back of your mind, investigators need to hear from you. You can submit a tip directly to the Pima County Sheriff's Department or through the FBI's tip line at tips.fbi.gov. The reward stands at over $1.2 million, and it remains unclaimed. That money exists for exactly this moment. One person, one detail, one connection they did not realize anyone else needed to know. Nancy left a family dinner on January 31st and never made it to church the next morning. Somewhere in the hours between those 2 moments, a plan that had been years in the construction finally reached its end point. 2 retired FBI profilers now say that plan was never built around her. It was built around the daughter the world watches every morning. And Nancy, quiet and private and entirely removed from that world, was simply the door that could be opened. The silence that has held for 3 months is carrying more weight than silence can sustain forever. It will break. And the next development in this case may arrive sooner than anyone expects. In the next video on this channel, there is one specific detail from the security camera footage that investigators have not discussed publicly. A detail that behavioral analysts say reveals something critical about the level of planning that went into that night. It is the kind of detail that, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And it may be the clearest window yet into who actually designed this. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it when it drops. 3 months. That is how long Nancy Guthrie has been missing. No body. No arrest. No explanation that holds together from beginning to end. Just silence, and a case that by every visible measure has hit a wall. The reward sits at over $1.2 million. Unclaimed. 30,000 tips have been reviewed by investigators. And not one of them has broken this open. Not one. Think about that number for a moment. 30,000 people called in, wrote in, reached out. And the case is still exactly where it was on the morning of February 1st, when Nancy did not show up to church and the world had not yet realized that something had gone terribly wrong the night before. January 31st started the way quiet evenings do. Nancy Guthrie, a private woman, the kind of person who does not chase headlines and has never asked to be in one, left a family dinner and went home. Her phone stayed inside the house. Her belongings were untouched. And sometime between that dinner and the following morning, someone entered her home with a plan. Not a panicked plan. Not an impulsive one. A plan that was calm, deliberate, and had been a long time in the making. A man appeared on her security camera that night. Gloves on. Backpack on. Moving with the kind of measured control that does not come from adrenaline. It comes from preparation. He had done this before in his mind. Many times. And when the moment finally arrived, his body already knew the steps. Blood was found on the front step. Nancy was gone. In the days that followed, Bitcoin ransom demands surfaced. Deadlines came and went. The family of one of the most recognized faces in morning television was now living inside a nightmare that felt like it had been scripted by someone who understood exactly how much pressure that name could generate. Savannah Guthrie. NBC. The Today Show. A daughter who went on air every morning while her mother was somewhere no one could find. The working assumption took shape fast. This was financial. The Bitcoin pointed that way. The ransom demands pointed that way. The calculated behavior of the man on camera pointed that way. Someone wanted money, and they had found the most visible pressure point available to get it. That assumption drove the conversation for 3 months. It was wrong. On April 30th, journalist Brian Entin sat down with 2 of the most decorated criminal profilers in FBI history. What they said in that interview did not add a new layer to the existing theory. It dismantled the theory entirely. Because according to these 2 men who have spent their careers studying how violent offenders think before anyone can stop them, everyone has been looking at this case from the wrong angle since the very first night. Nancy Guthrie was never the target. Hi viewers, here's a question, and the answer is simpler than you think. Do you believe the ransom demands in this case were real, or were they a distraction? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Because the answer to that question sits at the very center of what these profilers revealed. And once you understand what they said, the entire timeline of this case shifts. The motive shifts. The suspect profile shifts. And the reason this investigation has stalled for 3 months suddenly starts to make a different kind of sense. For 90 days, investigators and the public followed the money. They traced Bitcoin wallets. They analyzed ransom communications. They built a picture of a suspect motivated by financial gain, someone who saw a famous name attached to a vulnerable target and made a calculated move for profit. But here is what was sitting underneath that picture the entire time, quiet and unexamined. No ransom note was left at Nancy's home the night she disappeared. Not one. If you are entering someone's home to collect a ransom, the note is how the transaction begins. That is not opinion. That is the documented behavior of every financially motivated abduction on record. You leave the terms. You establish contact. You begin the negotiation at the scene. But there was nothing left behind that night. The notes that appeared afterward, the Bitcoin demands that consumed the early coverage of this case, those did not come from the person who walked through Nancy Guthrie's door. According to the profilers, those came from opportunists. People who saw a high-profile disappearance connected to a famous name and inserted themselves into the chaos for reasons of their own. The real perpetrator had no interest in cryptocurrency. Their interest was something that cannot be transferred into a digital wallet. And that is where this case stops being about money and starts being about something far more unsettling. Something that had been building long before January 31st. Something that began not with a plan to enter an elderly woman's home, but with a fixation on the daughter the whole world watches every morning. This is American Case File. And what you are about to hear is the most significant development in this investigation since the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Stay with this until the end. Because the last piece of what these profilers revealed changes not just the theory of this case. It changes the entire shape of it.